The divorce papers landed on the breakfast table with a sharp slap, right next to the birthday card Jessica hadn't bothered to sign. Her husband David sat frozen, fork halfway to his mouth, staring at the documents that would end their 7-year marriage. But what Jessica didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that the man she'd dismissed as a poor, unmotivated failure was actually the secret multi-billionaire real estate mogul who owned every single building in the Montgomery Properties empire, including the 60-story skyscraper where she worked as a junior marketing coordinator. She'd spent months planning this moment, timing it perfectly with her promotion to executive assistant for Richard Crane, the company's top sales broker, the man she believed was her ticket to the luxurious life she deserved. But the diamond on her finger, a gift from Richard, had been purchased with a company credit card that David personally funded. She thought she was trading up, moving from a husband who drove a 15-year-old sedan to a lover who arrived in chauffeur-driven luxury. But every penthouse Richard closed, every $1 million commission he earned, every congratulatory email he received, came from properties David had built from nothing. The irony twisted deeper still. Richard himself had no idea his boss, the mysterious D. Montgomery who signed his paychecks remotely, was the same loser whose wife he'd been seducing in corner offices and hotel suites for the past 6 months. Jessica had rehearsed her speech, prepared her justifications, steeled herself for tears or pleading, but she hadn't prepared for what David would do next. She hadn't prepared for the phone call that would come in 48 hours. She hadn't prepared for the revelation that would shatter her new world before it even began. Would the woman who'd spent years belittling her husband's lack of ambition survive discovering she'd just divorced the richest man in the city? Would the lover who'd promised her everything be able to protect her when his entire career vanished in a single board meeting? And would David, the man who'd loved her enough to hide his billions just to know if she loved him for who he was, show mercy? Or would he show her exactly what it felt like to lose everything? The morning of David's 34th birthday began the way most of his mornings had begun for the past 7 years, with Jessica already gone. But this particular morning carried a weight that made the silence in their small 2-bedroom apartment feel suffocating, pressing down on him like the accumulated disappointment of nearly a decade. David stood at the kitchen counter in his worn flannel pajamas, staring at the envelope propped against the coffee maker. His name was scrawled across it in Jessica's hurried handwriting, the letters slanting rightward as if they couldn't wait to escape the page. But he didn't need to open it to know what it contained. He'd seen the attorney's office charge on their shared credit card statement 3 weeks ago, $450 to Brennan and Associates, family law specialists. The coffee maker gurgled its final protest, and David poured himself a cup, his hands steady despite the tremor he felt deep in his chest. Through the window, the city sprawled before him, a glittering testament to ambition and wealth. Somewhere in that concrete jungle stood Montgomery Tower, the crown jewel of his real estate empire, though no one, not even his wife, knew that the shy, soft-spoken man who worked odd jobs and freelance consulting was actually David Montgomery, the phantom billionaire whose signature appeared on property deeds across 6 states. But the deception had been deliberate, necessary even. When he'd met Jessica 8 years ago at a community college business course, he'd been testing a theory that had haunted him since his first billion. Could someone love him for who he was rather than what he had? His father had died alone despite his fortune, surrounded by sycophants and gold diggers. His mother had been married 4 times, each husband more transparent in his greed than the last. David had vowed to be different. But now, staring at the envelope that would legally end his marriage, he wondered if his experiment had simply confirmed his worst fears. The envelope seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, but David left it sealed as he moved through his morning routine. He showered in the bathroom with the leaking faucet Jessica had nagged him about for months, dressed in the discount store clothes that made her cringe when they attended work functions, and slipped his feet into the scuffed sneakers that had survived 3 winters. But each mundane action felt like a countdown, seconds ticking toward an explosion he'd spent years trying to prevent. At precisely 8:47 a.m., Jessica's key turned in the lock. David looked up from his coffee, and for a moment, just a flickering, desperate moment, he thought he saw regret flash across her face. But then her expression hardened into the mask of determined righteousness. He'd watched her perfect over the past 6 months. "You're still here," Jessica said, setting down her designer handbag, a gift from Richard, though David knew she'd told him it was from a work bonus. She wore a Navy power suit that probably cost more than David supposedly earned in a month, but actually cost less than the cufflinks hidden in his safety deposit box. "I thought you'd be gone by now." "It's my birthday," David said quietly, gesturing to the sad little cupcake he'd bought himself from the bodega downstairs, a single candle stuck crookedly in the frosting. "Remember?" Jessica's jaw tightened, but she didn't apologize. She never apologized anymore. But she had once, in those early days when she'd believed in him, when his lack of material wealth had seemed romantic rather than pathetic, when she'd sworn that love mattered more than money. "Open the envelope, David," she said, crossing her arms. "We both know this has been coming." David took another sip of coffee, letting the bitter liquid ground him. But his mind was already 3 moves ahead, calculating outcomes and consequences the way he'd learned to do when negotiating $100 million deals. Is it him? Richard Crane. The shock on Jessica's face might have been satisfying under different circumstances, but David felt only a hollow ache where his heart used to be. She recovered quickly, though, her expression shifting from surprise to defiance. "How did you—" "I'm more observant than you think," David interrupted, which was true but incomplete. But what he didn't say was that he'd known about Richard for exactly 4 months, 17 days, and roughly 9 hours. Security footage didn't lie. His head of security had presented him with the evidence the same day it started. Grainy images of Jessica and Richard in the executive parking garage, their bodies pressed together against Richard's Mercedes, the same Mercedes that David's company subsidized. "It doesn't matter how you know," Jessica said, rallying. "What matters is that I deserve better than this." She gestured around the modest apartment with its second-hand furniture and outdated appliances, but missed entirely the first-edition books on the shelves that cost more than the building itself. "I deserve someone with ambition, someone going places, someone who doesn't need his wife to support him while he figures things out." The accusation stung because it was so carefully crafted, so meticulously one-sided, but Jessica didn't know about the shell companies and offshore accounts. She didn't know about the portfolio that could buy and sell Richard Crane 1,000 times over. She didn't know that every dollar she earned from Montgomery Properties, including her recent promotion, came from David's vision, David's risk, David's midnight negotiations, and strategic brilliance. "Richard has what you want," David said, not quite a question, but he needed to hear her say it, needed this final confirmation before he made his next move. "Richard is the top sales broker in the entire company," Jessica said, her voice taking on a dreamy quality that made David's stomach turn. "He closed the Riverside development last month, a $90 million deal. His commission alone was more than you've made in the entire time I've known you." But she paused, suddenly uncertain. "He's taking me to Paris next month. He's introducing me to his family in the Hamptons. He's everything you're not." David set down his coffee cup with exaggerated care, but his mind was already drafting the memo that would go out Monday morning. "When did it start? Does it matter?" Jessica shot back, but guilt flickered across her features. You stopped trying years ago, David. You stopped fighting for us. For me. I stopped trying? The words came out sharper than intended, but David couldn't contain the bitter laugh that followed. I worked myself to exhaustion trying to build something for us, for our future. Odd jobs aren't a future, Jessica snapped. Whatever it is you actually do, if you even do anything, it's not enough. It's never been enough. But her hand went unconsciously to the pendant around her neck, a delicate piece David had given her for their 5th anniversary, telling her it was a clever fake, but actually a flawless 5-carat diamond that had belonged to his grandmother. David stood slowly, deliberately, letting the full weight of the moment settle between them. But he didn't reach for the envelope. Not yet. And Richard is enough? Richard is a man who knows what he wants and goes after it, Jessica said. He's powerful, respected. He drives a car that costs more than you make in 5 years. He wears watches I can't even pronounce. He takes me to restaurants where the wait list is 6 months long. But she didn't mention that Richard was also married, separated but still legally bound, with 2 kids in boarding school and an ex-wife who was currently negotiating a settlement that would cripple him financially. Impressive, David murmured, but the word carried no admiration. And he knows you're married. Jessica's chin lifted defiantly, but her eyes wouldn't quite meet his. He knows I'm leaving you, that I deserve better, that I'm not going to waste my life waiting for you to become something you're not. The apartment suddenly felt too small, the walls closing in with the weight of accusations and broken promises. But David moved to the window, looking out at the skyline he'd helped build, at the monuments to his ambition that Jessica couldn't see because she'd never bothered to look past the surface. Montgomery Tower gleamed in the morning sun, its glass facade reflecting clouds and sky. Somewhere in that building, Richard Crane sat in an office David had personally designed, closing deals on properties David owned, seducing a woman David had loved with money that was ultimately David's. "Open the envelope, David," Jessica repeated, her voice softer now, almost pitying. "Sign the papers. Let's end this cleanly." David turned back to face her, and for a moment, he let his mask slip. But what Jessica saw in his expression wasn't defeat. It was something else entirely, something that made her step backward unconsciously. "You really don't know, do you?" "Know what?" Jessica's voice carried a note of uncertainty now, but she quickly smothered it with false confidence. "That you're going to make this difficult? That you're going to fight over our nothing? We don't have anything worth fighting over, David. Don't we?" David moved to the coffee table and finally picked up the envelope, but he didn't open it. Instead, he held it up to the light, as if he could read the words through the paper. "Tell me something, Jessica. In all the time you've been with Richard, in all those romantic dinners and weekend getaways, has he ever mentioned his boss?" The question clearly confused her, but she answered anyway. "What?" "I don't know. He reports to some executive committee or something. Why does that matter?" "Does he ever mention D. Montgomery?" David pressed, watching her face carefully. "The owner of the company?" Jessica shrugged, impatient, but her fingers had started worrying at the strap of her handbag. "It's some reclusive billionaire. Richard says nobody's ever met him. He signs off on major deals electronically. Why are you asking about this?" David set the envelope back down on the table, still sealed, but his hand was perfectly steady now. "Just curious about the man you're leaving me for. Curious about his world, his boss." But the truth was gathering like a storm on the horizon, ready to break. "You're deflecting," Jessica accused, but her confidence was wavering now, crack forming in her certainty. "This isn't about Richard or his job. This is about us, about how you've failed me." "Failed you," David repeated softly, but the words weren't a question. They were a meditation on irony so profound it nearly made him laugh. "I gave you everything I had, Jessica, everything that mattered. You gave me scraps, Jessica exploded, her composure finally shattering. You gave me a life of watching pennies and explaining to my friends why my husband doesn't have a real job. You gave me embarrassment and disappointment and broken promises about someday. But tears were forming in her eyes now, real and raw, suggesting that underneath the anger there might still be something salvageable. I gave you honesty, David said quietly, but he knew even as he said it that it was only partial truth. I gave you a life free from the complications that money brings, free from people who only want you for what you have. I don't want to be free from money, Jessica shouted, and there it was. The truth she'd probably been trying to suppress for years, now naked and undeniable between them. I want the life I deserve, the life Richard can give me, the life you promised but never delivered. David felt something fundamental shift inside him, the last remaining thread of hope finally snapping. But what replaced it wasn't anger or grief. It was a cold, calculating clarity he recognized from boardrooms and negotiations. Then open it, he said, nodding to the envelope. Open it and tell me what it says. Jessica hesitated, perhaps sensing that she'd crossed some invisible line, but her pride wouldn't let her back down now. She snatched up the envelope and tore it open with more violence than necessary. But as she scanned the first page, her face went pale. What is this? These aren't divorce papers. No? David's voice remained level, but inside he felt the mechanism clicking into place, the trap he'd set so carefully beginning to spring. What are they? This is... Jessica's hands were shaking now as she flipped through the pages. This is a prenuptial agreement. We never signed a prenup. We got married at City Hall with 2 witnesses. This is dated... But her voice trailed off as the implications began to penetrate. 7 years and 2 months ago, David confirmed, but he didn't move closer. 2 weeks before our actual wedding, before I knew for certain what we were to each other. This says... Jessica's voice had gone hollow, the papers trembling in her grip. This says your worth. This can't be real. This is some kind of joke. It's not a joke, David said softly, but his tone carried absolute finality. It's the truth. The truth I've been hiding because I needed to know if you could love me without it. You're D. Montgomery, Jessica whispered, but it wasn't quite a question. The color had drained entirely from her face now, leaving her looking almost translucent in the morning light. You own Montgomery Properties. You own... Oh my God, you own everything. Not everything, David corrected mildly, but his eyes never left her face. But yes, the company, the buildings, the developments Richard has been closing, those are mine. The 60-story tower where you work, I designed it. The promotion you got last month, I approved it. But he paused, letting each revelation land like a physical blow. The man you're leaving me for, he works for me. Jessica's legs seemed to give out, and she collapsed onto the couch, the prenuptial agreement scattering across her lap. But her eyes were wide, darting between David and the papers as if trying to reconcile 2 incompatible realities. This isn't possible. You wear clothes from Target. You drive that horrible car. You live here in this apartment. I chose to live here, David said, moving closer now but still maintaining distance. I chose all of it, the modest lifestyle, the careful obscurity, the test. But the word hung between them like an indictment. I needed to know if someone could love me for who I am rather than what I have. My father died alone, Jessica, surrounded by people who loved his money but despised him. I swore I'd never make that mistake. So you lied to me? Jessica's voice was rising again, but now it carried a note of panic rather than righteousness. You let me think we were struggling? You let me believe you were a failure? I never lied about who I was, David countered, but his voice remained calm, clinical even. I told you I worked in real estate development, I told you I consulted on major projects. Every word was true. You just made assumptions about the scale." But he sat down in the chair across from her, close enough to see the mascara starting to run from her tears. "I lived modestly because I wanted to see if you'd stay when things were hard, if you'd believe in me without proof of success." "That's not fair," Jessica was crying openly now, but whether from rage or grief or fear was impossible to tell. "You don't get to test people like that. You don't get to play God with someone's life. And you don't get to betray your vows the moment someone with a bigger paycheck shows interest," David shot back, but his voice cracked slightly on the last word. "Richard Crane. Really? The man is a walking cliché, Jessica. Married to his job, drowning in debt from his divorce, maintaining a lifestyle he can barely afford by maxing out every credit card and company perk I give him." Jessica's head snapped up, but confusion clouded her features. "He's not. Richard said he's worth millions. He said his commission from the Riverside deal alone was $3 million. Yes," David confirmed, but his smile was bitter, of which he saw approximately $800,000 after taxes, agent splits, and the massive balloon payment on his ex-wife's settlement. He spent $600,000 of that on the Mercedes he drives, the watch he wears, and the Paris trip he's promised you. But David pulled out his phone and scrolled to a document. He currently has $47,000 in liquid assets and is carrying $218,000 in high-interest debt. The company subsidizes his lifestyle because he's good at closing deals, but he's one bad quarter away from bankruptcy. The information seemed to physically wound Jessica, her body curling inward as each fact landed, but she rallied one more time, desperately. "You're lying. You're making this up to punish me." "Am I?" David turned the phone to show her Richard's credit report, his financial disclosure forms, the emails Richard had sent to HR, begging for advances on future commissions. "I own the company, Jessica. I have access to everything, including the security footage from the executive parking garage, the hotel receipts charged to his corporate card, the jewelry he bought you with an account I personally fund." Jessica's hand went to the diamond at her neck, but this time her fingers trembled. "No. No, he said what you wanted to hear," David interrupted, but his voice had lost its edge, replaced by a weary sadness. He saw an unhappy wife with access to the executive floor and thought he could trade up. He's done it before, 3 times that I know of. He has a type. Married women who work in the building, who are dissatisfied with their lives, who are impressed by the trappings of success. "Stop," Jessica whispered, but she didn't sound convincing, even to herself. "Just stop." "You want me to stop?" David stood again, moving to his desk in the corner of the apartment, the one piece of furniture that didn't match the carefully curated poverty aesthetic. But he pulled out a folder thick with documents and photographs. "Or do you want to know the truth? Because I have 6 months of it here. Every dinner, every hotel, every lie he told you, and every lie you told me." Jessica's eyes fixed on the folder with horrified fascination, but she didn't reach for it. "Why?" she finally whispered. "If you knew, why didn't you stop it? Why didn't you confront me?" "Because I kept hoping you'd stop on your own," David admitted, and for the first time his voice carried genuine pain. "I kept thinking that the woman I married, the woman who used to quote poetry to me in that community college classroom, who cried watching sunsets, who said she'd follow me anywhere, that she was still in there somewhere, that she'd remember why she married me." "That woman married someone with potential," Jessica said, but her voice was hollow now, automatic. "Someone who promised her a future." "And I gave you one," David said, spreading his arms to encompass not the small apartment, but the entire city beyond the windows. I built an empire while you slept next to me every night. I created wealth that could support 10 generations. I designed buildings that will stand for centuries." But his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "And I did it all while coming home to you every night, hoping that someday I could reveal it all and you'd be happy, that you'd understand why I waited." Silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. But through the window, the city continued its indifferent hum, sirens wailing, horns honking, millions of people pursuing their own dreams and dramas, unaware that in this modest apartment, an empire was crumbling under the weight of betrayal. "What happens now?" Jessica finally asked, her voice small. "What are you going to do?" David returned to the coffee table and picked up the envelope again, but this time he opened it himself, pulling out the papers inside. "These aren't divorce papers," he said quietly. "They're yours. Your divorce papers, the ones you had drawn up." Jessica's confusion was evident, but she didn't interrupt as David continued. "I intercepted them 3 days ago when the process server came to the building. I wanted to read them first. Wanted to see how you'd frame our ending." But he flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. "You're asking for half of everything: the apartment, the car, any retirement accounts, future earnings." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Based on what you think I'm worth, you're asking for about $35,000 total." The number hung in the air between them, suddenly absurd in light of everything they now knew. But Jessica didn't laugh. She looked like she might be sick. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "I believe you," David said, and he meant it. But belief didn't erase the betrayal, didn't undo the months of deception. Which makes this easier in a way. The prenup you just read, it's real and legally binding. I had it drawn up by the best attorneys in the state, had it notarized and witnessed, had it filed with the county clerk. You remember that weekend I supposedly went to visit my sick aunt in Connecticut? Jessica nodded mutely, but her eyes were filled with dawning horror. "I flew you out separately to meet with an independent attorney who explained every clause. You signed it in their office, not even realizing what you were signing, because I'd told you it was just paperwork for health insurance." David's voice was matter-of-fact, but each word felt like a stone dropped into a deep well. "It's all legal, all binding. In the event of divorce due to adultery, you get nothing. Not the apartment, which I own. Not the car, which is registered to one of my companies. Not a share of any assets accumulated during the marriage." "You can't—" Jessica's protest died before it fully formed, but her eyes desperately searched his face for some sign of mercy. "That's not— Courts don't honor agreements like that." "They do when they're properly executed and when there's documented evidence of adultery," David said, pulling out his phone again. "I have testimony from security personnel, hotel staff, restaurant employees. I have credit card receipts and GPS data from your phone, which is on a company plan I control. I have emails you sent Richard from your work computer, which is company property subject to monitoring." But he paused, letting the full weight of her situation settle over her. "You signed away your right to my assets, Jessica, and then you committed the one act that voided any minimal settlement you might have been entitled to." Jessica's face had gone beyond pale to a grayish shade that suggested she might actually faint, but she remained upright, her hands clutching at the couch cushions, as if they were the only solid things in a world suddenly turned liquid and uncertain. "Please, David, please, I made a mistake. I was stupid and selfish and cruel, but please don't do this." "Do what?" David asked, and his voice was genuinely curious rather than cruel. "Enforce an agreement we both signed. Protect assets I built. React to your betrayal by protecting myself?" "Destroy my life," Jessica whispered, but tears were streaming down her face now, her carefully applied makeup running in dark rivulets. Ruin me completely. David studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. But then he moved to sit beside her on the couch, close enough that she could see the lines of sleeplessness around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the weight of secrets carried for so many years. I don't want to destroy you, Jessica. Despite everything, I don't want that. Hope flickered across her face, but David held up a hand before she could speak. But I can't let this go unpunished either. Actions have consequences. Choices matter. He pulled out his phone one more time, scrolling to a document. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign the divorce papers. My lawyer will send you proper ones, not these amateur ones you drew up. You'll get a one-time settlement of $50,000, enough to start over somewhere new. But you'll also sign an NDA about my identity and assets. And if I refuse, Jessica's voice was small, but a spark of her old defiance remained. Then I enforce the prenup as written, which gives you nothing, and I make sure everyone you work with knows exactly what you did and who you did it with, David said flatly, but his eyes held hers with unwavering intensity. Richard will be fired for ethics violations, sleeping with married employees, misusing company resources, lying on financial disclosures. His career in real estate will be over. Every firm in the city will know why, and you'll be known as the woman who threw away billions for a man who couldn't afford his own lifestyle. The threat was delivered without malice, simply a statement of cause and effect. But Jessica's shoulders sagged, defeated. What about Richard? What happens to him? That depends on you, David said, standing and moving to the window again. But this time his gaze was fixed on Montgomery Tower, the building that bore his name even if no one knew it. If you cooperate, sign the papers, take the settlement, and disappear quietly, I'll simply fire him. He'll get severance, a neutral reference, a chance to rebuild somewhere else. But if you fight me, if you try to contest the prenup or go public with any of this, I'll bury him. I'll make sure every unethical deal, every padded expense report, every corner he's cut becomes public knowledge. I'll sue him personally for the company resources he misused. I'll make him toxic. You'd really do that? Jessica asked, but she already knew the answer. To protect what I've built? To ensure my privacy? David turned back to face her, and his expression was granite hard. Without hesitation, I've worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let it be destroyed by someone who saw me as a meal ticket rather than a person. Jessica flinched at the characterization, but she didn't deny it. But after a long moment, she nodded slowly. Okay, I'll sign. I'll take the settlement. I'll sign the NDA. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. But answer me one thing, honestly. Did you ever really love me, or was I always just an experiment? The question cut deeper than David expected, and for the first time since she'd arrived that morning, he felt his composure waver, but he took a breath and answered truthfully. I loved who I thought you were. I loved the woman in that classroom who talked about building a life based on connection rather than possessions. I loved the woman who said that money didn't matter as long as we had each other. He paused, his voice rough. But I don't know if that woman ever really existed, or if she was just playing a role too. Jessica absorbed this, and something like understanding passed between them. Not forgiveness, but a mutual recognition of failure. But before she could respond, David's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and a cold smile touched his lips. Interesting timing, that's Richard. What does he want? Jessica asked, but dread colored her voice. David read the message aloud. Hey boss, requesting Monday off for personal matters. Need to help my girlfriend with something important. We'll make up the time Tuesday. He sent it to my executive assistant, not knowing she forwards everything directly to me. But David looked up from the phone, his eyes hard. He's planning to be there when you supposedly serve me divorce papers, playing the supportive new boyfriend, Noble. Jessica's face crumpled, but she didn't defend Richard. But she did ask, "What are you going to tell him?" "Nothing, yet." David typed a quick response. "But Monday morning he's going to receive a memo requesting his presence at an emergency board meeting, 9 a.m. sharp, mandatory attendance." But David's smile widened slightly. "You're welcome to be there too, Jessica. In fact, I insist on it. Consider it your last day at Montgomery Properties." "You're going to expose him in front of everyone?" Jessica looked genuinely horrified, but also resigned. "In front of the whole executive team?" "I'm going to do what I should have done months ago," David corrected. But his voice carried no satisfaction, only weary necessity. "I'm going to protect my company from someone who's been systematically violating ethics policies and misrepresenting himself to employees. The fact that one of those employees was my wife, that just makes it personal." Jessica stood on shaking legs, gathering her purse and the scattered papers, but at the door she paused. "For what it's worth, David, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't see what was right in front of me. I'm sorry I cared more about appearances than reality." But tears were flowing freely now, unchecked. "And I'm sorry I didn't trust you enough to wait and see who you'd become." "I already was who I'd become," David said softly, but without rancor. "You just couldn't see it because you weren't looking." But as she reached for the door handle, he added, "Jessica, the settlement offer expires Tuesday at close of business. After that, you get nothing but what the prenup specifies. Don't test me on this." She nodded once, a broken, jerky motion, and then she was gone, the door closing with a quiet click that sounded like the ending of an era. But David stood alone in the apartment, his apartment, though it had never felt less like home, and stared at the sad little birthday cupcake with its crooked candle. Happy birthday, he thought bitterly. Happy birthday to the man who had everything except the one thing he'd actually wanted. But there was no time for self-pity. David pulled out his phone and dialed a number he had memorized but rarely called. "Marcus, it's David. I need you to prepare for a termination meeting Monday morning. Richard Crane, senior sales broker. Yes, I know what it looks like, but I have documentation. Ethics violations, misuse of company resources, undisclosed conflicts of interest." He paused, listening. "And Marcus, I need you to prepare divorce proceedings as well. Use the Brennan prenup. Yes, that one. It's time." The call ended, and David moved through the apartment mechanically, already planning his next moves. But everything felt hollow now, as if the victory he'd spent years preparing for had turned to ash the moment it arrived. He'd been right. Jessica had only loved what she thought he could give her, not who he was. But being right had never felt so much like losing. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp, clear weather that real estate developers loved. Perfect conditions for photographing properties and closing deals. But for Richard Crane, striding into Montgomery Tower in his $3,000 suit and Italian leather shoes, the beauty of the day was just another confirmation that his life was finally coming together. He'd spent the weekend with Jessica, helping her plan her future, as she delicately put it, though they both knew what she meant. Planning their future together once the dead weight of her loser husband was finally cut loose. But Richard had played his part perfectly. Supportive but not pushy. Generous but not overbearing. Successful but humble enough to seem like he'd earned it rather than lucked into it. The Montgomery Tower lobby gleamed with the kind of understated wealth that Richard had learned to recognize and covet. Italian marble floors, custom light fixtures, original artwork that probably cost more than most people's houses. But he barely noticed it anymore, too accustomed to walking these halls as if he owned them, which in a sense he almost did. He was the top broker after all, the man who closed the impossible deals, the face of Montgomery Properties in the luxury market. "Morning, Mr. Crane," the security guard called out. but Richard barely acknowledged him, too focused on the phone call he was about to make to Jessica. But before he could dial, his phone buzzed with a message from Executive Administration. Emergency board meeting, 9 a.m., executive conference room, mandatory attendance. Richard frowned, but mostly with annoyance rather than concern. Board meetings were usually scheduled weeks in advance, coordinated around the busy schedules of executives and major stakeholders. But emergency meetings usually meant big news, maybe an acquisition or a major new development or possibly even a promotion for certain high-performing brokers. Richard's frown shifted to a slight smile. Maybe the mysterious D. Montgomery had finally noticed his record-breaking quarter, but as Richard stepped into the elevator, he noticed something odd. Several other executives were already inside, and none of them would meet his eyes. Thomas from legal, Sarah from HR, Michael from finance, all present, all avoiding his gaze. But Richard was too confident in his own position to feel real concern. Whatever this meeting was about, it surely didn't involve him in any negative way. The executive conference room occupied the entire 58th floor, a stunning space with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering panoramic views of the city. But when Richard entered, he found it oddly sparse. Just a single long table, a few chairs, and a projection screen at one end. The usual bustle of assistants and junior executives was absent, leaving only the senior staff arranged around the table like judges at a trial. And at the head of the table, in a chair Richard had never seen occupied, sat a man he didn't recognize but who somehow seemed familiar. But the man wore an immaculate charcoal suit that Richard's trained eye immediately identified as bespoke Savile Row, probably $15,000 minimum. His watch was an understated Patek Philippe that cost more than Richard's car. His presence commanded the room in a way that made everyone else seem like extras in his movie. "Mr. Crane," the man said, his voice cool and professional, "please sit down." Richard sat, but confusion was starting to edge into his confidence. "I'm sorry, have we met? I don't believe I caught your name." "No, we haven't met. Not formally." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "But you've been signing my paychecks for 3 years now. I'm David Montgomery." The name hit Richard like a physical blow, and for a moment the room seemed to tilt on its axis, but that was impossible. D. Montgomery was a recluse, a phantom, someone who operated entirely through intermediaries and electronic communications. The staff had theories about him ranging from the reasonable, eccentric billionaire to the absurd, actually a committee rather than a person, but nobody had ever claimed to have met him. "I don't understand," Richard managed, but his voice had lost its usual confidence. "You're the owner, but I thought—" "You thought a lot of things," David interrupted, smoothly, but his tone remained pleasant, almost conversational. "You thought I'd never bother to check security footage. You thought company resources were yours to do with as you pleased. You thought sleeping with married employees was a harmless way to pass the time between deals." But David opened a folder in front of him. "You thought wrong on all counts." Richard's blood turned to ice, but he tried to rally, to project the same unflappable confidence that had closed 100 difficult deals. "I'm not sure what you're implying, but I assure you everything I've done has been in the best interests of Montgomery Properties. My sales record speaks for itself." "Your sales record is exceptional," David agreed, but his tone suggested this was not actually a positive thing. $347 million in closed deals over 3 years, commissions totaling $11 million, top performer 5 quarters running. But David looked up from the folder, his gaze sharp as a scalpel. "All of which makes your systematic violation of company ethics policies even more disappointing." "Ethics policies?" Richard's lawyer instincts kicked in. Deny, deflect, demand specifics. "I've never violated any—" Section 4.7 of your employment contract prohibits personal relationships with married employees without disclosure to HR, David interrupted, sliding a document across the table. You've been conducting an affair with Jessica Lynn from the marketing department for 6 months without filing the required disclosure. That's violation number 1. Richard's mouth went dry, but he forced himself to remain calm. I'm not married. Jessica is getting divorced. There's no violation. Jessica is still legally married, David corrected, his voice maddeningly level. And even if she weren't, you were required to disclose the relationship within 30 days of its commencement. You've disclosed nothing. But David slid another document forward. Violation number 2, misuse of company resources. You've charged personal expenses to your corporate card in excess of $47,000 over the past 6 months. Hotel rooms in Paris booked but never used for business. Jewelry purchased with company funds. Restaurant bills that have nothing to do with client entertainment. Those were client expenses, Richard protested, but sweat was beginning to form on his forehead. Everything was legitimate business development. Really? David's eyebrows rose. Then perhaps you can explain why your client dinner at Le Bernardin 2 weeks ago was attended only by you and Ms. Lynn, lasted 3 hours, and included a bottle of wine that costs more than the average American's monthly rent. Which client were you entertaining? The question hung in the air, unanswerable, but Richard tried anyway. That was a mistake in the expense. Coding. It should have been marked personal. I meant to reimburse the company. Interesting, David mused, pulling out yet another document. Because you've made that same mistake 14 times in the past 6 months. Always on dates that correspond with your hotel bookings. Always involving Ms. Lynn. Always conveniently forgotten until now. But David's expression hardened. But those are relatively minor issues compared to violation number 3. Richard felt his last vestiges of confidence crumbling, but he couldn't stop himself from asking, what's violation 3? Fraud, David said simply, and the word fell like a guillotine blade. You've been representing your personal financial situation to Ms. Lynn as significantly more robust than it actually is. You've claimed assets you don't have, minimized debts you're drowning in, and generally painted a picture of wealth that's entirely fictional. That's not... How is that a company matter? Richard sputtered, but panic was seeping into his voice now. My personal finances are nobody's business. They become the company's business when you use company resources to maintain the illusion, David countered, his tone still infuriatingly calm. The car you drive is leased through a company program for top performers, a program that requires you to maintain certain sales thresholds and ethical standards. You're currently in violation of both. The watch you're wearing was purchased with an advance on commissions you haven't actually earned yet. The lifestyle you've been using to seduce my employees is funded almost entirely by Montgomery Properties. Richard's world was collapsing in real time, but one part of David's statement finally penetrated his panic. Wait, your employees? But you said... And then the pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Jessica, she's your... Oh, God. She's my wife, David confirmed, but his voice carried no emotion, just stark fact. Or she was until she decided you were a better option, but that's actually not relevant to this meeting. What's relevant is that you systematically violated company policy, committed fraud using company resources, and engaged in behavior that brings Montgomery Properties into disrepute. This is personal, Richard accused, finding his footing in righteous indignation, even as everything else fell apart. You're firing me because I'm with your wife. This is revenge, pure and simple. Revenge would be publicizing every detail of your financial house of cards, David said mildly, but steel underlay his words. Revenge would be making sure every real estate firm in this city knows exactly what you did and how you did it. Revenge would be suing you personally for every misappropriated dollar and forcing you into bankruptcy. But David leaned forward slightly. What I'm offering instead is a quiet termination with severance and a neutral reference. You sign the separation agreement, you return all company property, you exit gracefully, and your career merely takes a hit rather than ending entirely. And if I refuse? Richard's voice was hollow, but he had to ask. Then I stop being generous, David said, opening another folder that seemed to contain hundreds of pages. I have documentation of every violation, every lie, every expense report you've fudged. I have testimony from hotel staff, restaurant servers, credit card companies. I have emails you sent from your company computer, planning getaways with my wife on company time. I have proof that you forged client signatures on feedback forms to inflate your performance reviews. But David's eyes were cold now, all pretense of politeness abandoned. I will bury you, Richard. Professionally, financially, personally. I will make you unhireable. Is that clear enough? The room was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system and Richard's ragged breathing. But everyone else at the table, the lawyers, the HR director, the finance team, simply watched with expressions that ranged from professional detachment to barely concealed satisfaction. Nobody was coming to his defense. Nobody was questioning David's narrative. But most tellingly, nobody seemed surprised by any of this. When do I need to sign? Richard finally asked, and his voice was barely above a whisper. Today, David said, sliding a thick packet of paper across the table. You have until close of business. After that, the offer expires and we proceed with litigation. But David stood, buttoning his suit jacket with crisp efficiency. There's someone here who I think you'll want to see before you make your final decision. David nodded to someone by the door, and Richard turned to see Jessica entering the conference room. But she looked nothing like the confident, put-together woman he'd been dating. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face pale, her professional demeanor completely shattered. But when she met Richard's gaze, something passed between them that was part accusation and part shared defeat. Tell him, David said to Jessica, his voice not unkind but absolutely firm. Tell him what we discussed. Jessica's hands twisted together, but she forced herself to look at Richard. He knows everything, about us, about all of it. He's known for months. But her voice cracked. He's offering me a settlement to go away quietly, $50,000 and an NDA. If I take it and disappear, he won't press charges or publicize anything. Charges? Richard's voice climbed an octave. What charges? Adultery is still technically illegal in this state, though rarely prosecuted, David explained conversationally. But more relevant are the potential charges for conspiracy to defraud. You helped Jessica plan to extract assets from our marriage using false pretenses. You encouraged her to file for divorce based on significantly incorrect assumptions about my net worth. And you did so while in a position of trust within my company. That's insane, Richard protested, but even he could hear how weak it sounded. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know she was your wife when we started. But he cut himself off, realizing he'd just admitted to the affair. Actually, you did know, David corrected, pulling out yet another document. Seemingly, he had an endless supply. Jessica told you she was married in your second conversation. You can see it here in the text messages recovered from your company phone, which reminder is company property subject to monitoring. But David read aloud, Your husband sounds like a loser. You deserve someone who can give you what you want. That's you, Richard. 2 days after you met Jessica at the company holiday party. Richard had no response. But he looked at Jessica with something approaching betrayal, as if this was somehow her fault for not being more discreet, for not protecting him better. But Jessica just looked back with empty eyes that said she had nothing left to give him. "I'll sign," Richard said finally, reaching for the separation agreement with hands that shook slightly. "I'll sign and I'll go." "Smart choice," David said, but there was no triumph in his voice, just weary satisfaction at a difficult task completed. "Ms. Patterson from HR will witness your signature and collect all company property, phone, laptop, building access card, credit cards, everything. Security will escort you to your office to collect personal items, and then escort you from the building. You have 2 hours. Richard signed without reading the document, knowing that fighting was pointless and would only make things worse. But as he stood to leave, he couldn't resist one parting shot. "You know what's funny? I actually did care about her. It wasn't just about money or status. I thought we had something real." "Did you?" David's voice was soft, almost sympathetic. "Or did you care about the idea of her, the trophy wife who made you feel successful, the validation that you could take something from someone else?" But David shook his head slightly. "It doesn't matter now. You both made your choices. Now you live with the consequences." Richard left with as much dignity as he could salvage, which wasn't much. But Jessica remained, standing uncertainly by the door, as if waiting for permission to leave or speak or simply exist. But David gathered his papers with methodical care, not looking at her. "David," Jessica finally said, her voice small, "thank you for giving me an option." "Don't thank me," David replied, but he still didn't look up from his papers. "I'm not being generous, I'm being practical. A messy, public divorce would damage the company and expose me to scrutiny I don't want. The settlement is the price of my privacy, not a gift to you." "Still," Jessica persisted, moving closer to the table, "you could have destroyed me. You could have left me with nothing and made sure everyone knew what I did. But you didn't." David finally looked up, and his expression was impossible to read, somewhere between pity and exhaustion and resignation. "Despite everything, Jessica, I'm not a cruel man. I'm angry and hurt and betrayed, but I don't want to ruin your life. I just want you out of it." But he pulled out a final folder and slid it across to her. "The divorce papers are ready. Sign them today, take the settlement, and disappear. Start over somewhere else. Find whatever it is you're actually looking for." Jessica picked up the folder with trembling hands, but she didn't open it. "What if I can't find it? What if what I had with you was the best thing and I just couldn't see it?" "Then you'll have learned an expensive lesson," David said, standing and moving toward the windows, his back to her now. "But that's not my problem anymore. My problem is rebuilding a life I thought I was building with a partner, but was apparently building alone." But his voice softened slightly. "For what it's worth, I really did love you, the person I thought you were. I hope you find whatever version of yourself you're looking for." Jessica wanted to say something more, to apologize properly or explain or justify, but she recognized the dismissal in his posture. But she left the conference room with the divorce papers clutched to her chest, passing Richard in the hallway where security was already boxing up his office, both of them ruined in different ways by their own choices and David's methodical revelation of truth. 3 months later, David stood in his real penthouse, not the modest apartment he'd shared with Jessica, but the stunning 3-story space at the top of Montgomery Tower that he'd designed but never lived in. But the floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the entire city, a testament to everything he'd built and everything he'd lost in the building of it. The divorce was finalized. Jessica had taken her settlement and moved to Portland, where she'd opened a small marketing consultancy that would probably struggle but might eventually succeed if she worked hard enough. But David had kept his word. No publicity, no destruction, just a quiet exit and a chance to start over. He'd heard through intermediaries that she and Richard had tried to make it work for about 6 weeks, before reality and resentment destroyed whatever they'd thought they had. But Richard had found a job with a mid-tier real estate firm in Philadelphia, taking a 60% pay cut and a massive blow to his ego. David occasionally wondered if he'd learned anything from the experience, but mostly, he didn't think about them at all. The company had weathered the turmoil without anyone outside the executive team knowing the details. But David had promoted from within to fill Richard's role, choosing a younger broker with genuine talent and, more importantly, genuine integrity. Sales had barely dipped. The machine kept running because David had built it to run regardless of individual components. But David himself struggled with what came next. He was 34 years old, worth several $billions, running a company that owned property in 6 states and was expanding internationally. But every success felt hollow without someone to share it with. His experiment had failed, or perhaps succeeded, in proving his worst fears. Money did matter to people, often more than character or connection or genuine love. "Mr. Montgomery?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom, professional and distant. "Your 4 o'clock is here." David checked his watch, a modest Seiko that he'd worn through his entire marriage and refused to replace despite now being able to afford any watch on earth. But he'd kept many of his modest habits, finding that the trappings of wealth still felt performative and false. "Send them in." The woman who entered wasn't what David expected, but then again, he wasn't sure what he'd been expecting when his head of HR had mentioned a unusual hire prospect that needed his personal approval. She was maybe 30, dressed in professional but not expensive clothes, carrying a portfolio that looked well used. But her eyes swept the penthouse with appreciation rather than greed, noting the architecture and design rather than calculating the cost. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Rachel Torres. Thank you for seeing me." David shook her hand, gesturing to the seating area by the windows. "My HR director says you have an interesting proposal, something about affordable housing development." "I do," Rachel said, settling into her chair with calm confidence that suggested she was used to pitching ideas to skeptical executives. "I know Montgomery Properties focuses primarily on luxury developments, high-end residential, premium commercial space, that sort of thing, but I think there's an opportunity in the mid-market affordable housing sector that's being overlooked." "Go on," David said, genuinely curious despite himself. But most developers avoided affordable housing because the margins were thin and the regulatory headaches were substantial. For the next hour, Rachel laid out a vision for sustainable, well-designed, affordable housing that could be profitable while still serving genuine community needs. But she didn't just have ideas, she had numbers, architectural concepts, financing models, and partnership proposals with city agencies and non-profits. She'd clearly spent years developing this proposal, refining it, waiting for the right opportunity. "This is impressive," David said when she finished, flipping through her detailed prospectus. "But why come to Montgomery? There are developers who specialize in this kind of project." "Because they don't build like you do," Rachel said simply, meeting his eyes with directness that reminded him painfully of Jessica in their early days, before cynicism and materialism had poisoned everything. "I've studied your buildings, Mr. Montgomery. You don't cut corners. You use quality materials. You design for permanence rather than profit maximization. But your luxury developments demonstrate that you understand how good architecture improves people's lives." She leaned forward slightly. "I want to bring that same quality to people who can't afford luxury, people who deserve beautiful, functional, sustainable homes, but have been forgotten by most of the industry." David found himself genuinely moved by her passion, but also intrigued by her approach. "And you think this can be profitable?" "I think it can be sustainable," Rachel corrected, The margins won't be anything like your luxury projects, but if done right, it can generate steady returns while also building community goodwill and potentially opening doors with city agencies for future premium developments. But she smiled slightly. Plus, it's the right thing to do. I'm guessing that matters to you, based on your company's environmental policies and community investment programs. You've done your homework, David observed, impressed despite himself. But he found himself wondering about her story. What drove her to this particular passion? Tell me something not in your proposal. Why does this matter to you personally? Rachel hesitated, clearly debating how much to reveal, but then seemed to decide honesty was her best strategy. I grew up in public housing, not terrible, but not great. Buildings that were functional but soulless. Communities that could have been vibrant but felt like warehouses for poor people. But her voice grew stronger. I studied architecture in college, put myself through on scholarships and student loans. I wanted to prove that affordable housing didn't have to be ugly or depressing, that people deserve beauty and quality regardless of their income. She met his eyes again. I've been pitching this concept for 3 years. Every developer says it's interesting, but nobody takes the risk. I'm hoping you're different. David studied her for a long moment, seeing not just a business proposal but a possible path forward. But he also saw someone driven by genuine passion rather than greed, someone who measured success in community impact rather than just profit margins. What if I offered you something better than just approval for this project? Rachel's expression shifted from hopeful to confused. I'm not sure I follow. I have a position opening up in my development division, Director of Community Projects, David said, the idea forming even as he spoke. It's a newly created role, focused on exactly the kind of work you're describing, sustainable, affordable, community-oriented development. You'd have a budget, a team, and my backing to prove your concept. But he paused, making sure she understood the significance. You'd also be taking a risk. If the projects fail, the position goes away. If they succeed, you'd be building something genuinely new in this industry. Rachel's eyes widened, but she didn't immediately accept, which David respected. What's the catch? Nobody offers that kind of opportunity without strings attached. The catch is that I need people I can trust, David said honestly, deciding that if he was going to build a new professional life, it needed to be built on honesty rather than secrets. I need people who care about the work itself rather than the status or compensation, people who are driven by vision rather than greed. But he smiled slightly. I've recently learned the hard way to value those qualities. Something in his tone must have conveyed more than his words, because Rachel's expression softened with understanding. Someone hurt you, someone who cared more about what you could give them than who you were. Is it that obvious? David asked, surprised by her perceptiveness. Only to someone who's been there, Rachel said quietly. My ex-husband left me for his boss, someone who could advance his career and give him the lifestyle he wanted. But I wasn't enough because I cared more about meaningful work than making money. But she straightened her shoulders. But that's his loss and my liberation. I got to keep my integrity and my vision. David felt something shift in his chest. Not attraction exactly, but recognition. But here was someone who understood loss and betrayal, but hadn't let it poison her dreams or corrupt her values. Then let's liberate each other, he said, extending his hand across the table. Build something worth building with someone who values the building as much as the built. Rachel shook his hand, her grip firm, and David felt the first stirring of hope he'd experienced since Jessica had walked out. But this wasn't about romance or redemption. It was about finding purpose beyond profit, about using his wealth for something more meaningful than luxury towers and executive perks. Over the following months, David threw himself into the community development project with an intensity that surprised even him. But working with Rachel and her growing team, he rediscovered the passion that had driven him to build his empire in the first place. Not the money, but the creation itself. The transformation of empty spaces into functioning communities. The satisfaction of solving complex problems with elegant solutions. The first affordable housing project broke ground in a neighborhood that had been ignored by developers for decades. But David insisted on the same quality standards he demanded for his luxury properties: energy-efficient systems, durable materials, thoughtful design that created community spaces, and natural light. The costs were higher than typical affordable housing, but still viable when spread across multiple units and supplemented by tax incentives and public-private partnerships that Rachel had expertly negotiated. But more surprisingly, the project generated positive press that David's luxury developments never had. Newspapers ran features on the billionaire developer with a conscience. Architecture magazines praised the design. Community organizers called it a model for how development should work. But David remained largely in the background, letting Rachel be the public face of the initiative, content to stay mysterious and obscure. He still maintained his modest personal habits, still drove an unremarkable car, still lived in spaces that didn't advertise his wealth. But now it wasn't a test or an experiment, it was simply who he'd discovered he actually was. The money mattered less than what he could build with it. The empire mattered less than the communities it housed. The success mattered less than the integrity of the work itself. One evening, nearly a year after his divorce finalized, David stood on the roof of his affordable housing project, watching families move into brand new apartments that would actually be affordable for teachers and nurses and small business owners. But Rachel stood beside him, both of them tired but satisfied, watching their vision become tangible reality. "Thank you," Rachel said quietly, "for taking a chance on this, on me. Thank you for reminding me why I got into this business in the first place," David countered, but his voice was warm. "For helping me see that wealth is only meaningful when it serves purposes beyond itself." They stood in comfortable silence as the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. But David felt something he hadn't felt in years: contentment not based on acquisition or achievement, but on contribution and connection. He'd lost a wife but gained a purpose, but he'd been betrayed but found integrity. He'd faced his worst fears about love and money and human nature, but discovered that while those fears were valid, they weren't the whole story. "David," Rachel's voice interrupted his contemplation. "I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I'm curious about something." "Ask," David said, genuinely open to whatever she wanted to know. "The mysterious past you mentioned. The person who hurt you," Rachel said carefully. "Have you forgiven them?" David considered the question seriously, watching the lights come on in the apartments below as families settled into their new homes. "I don't know if forgiveness is the right word," he finally said, "but I've stopped being angry. I've stopped letting their choices define my value or my future." But he turned to look at Rachel directly. "They showed me who they really were. I'm grateful for that clarity, even though the method of revelation was painful." Rachel nodded, understanding, but her expression suggested she had more to say. "For what it's worth, I think they were fools. Anyone who couldn't see your value wasn't looking." "Maybe," David allowed, but he smiled slightly. "Or maybe we were just wrong for each other. Maybe I needed someone who valued buildings over bank accounts, creation over consumption, purpose over prestige." But he paused, suddenly aware that he was describing qualities Rachel herself embodied. "Maybe I needed to stop testing people and start trusting that the right person would value the right things naturally." Rachel held his gaze for a moment that stretched just a bit longer than professional courtesy required, but then she smiled and turned back to the view. "Well, when you find that person, I hope you'll invite me to the wedding. I'd love to see what kind of ceremony someone with your resources, but your values would create." David laughed, genuinely amused. Probably something small and intimate. Maybe on a roof like this one, surrounded by things we've built rather than things we've bought. "That sounds perfect," Rachel said, and something in her tone suggested she wasn't just speaking hypothetically. But David didn't push, didn't make assumptions, didn't rush toward conclusions. But he'd learned patience through pain, learned that real connection couldn't be forced or tested or manipulated into existence. It simply was, or it wasn't. But standing there on the roof of his community housing project, watching families begin new chapters in spaces he'd helped create, with a partner who shared his values and his vision, David felt for the first time that maybe his story wasn't ending. Maybe it was just beginning properly, built on foundations of honesty rather than deception, partnership rather than possession, purpose rather than profit. The divorce from Jessica had cost him relatively little financially. $50,000 was nothing to someone worth billions, but it had cost him his innocence about human nature and his illusion that he could control how people saw him. But in exchange, he'd gained clarity about what actually mattered and the freedom to build a life based on authentic values rather than tests and games. Richard had sent one email 6 months after his termination, attempting something like an apology, but David had deleted it unread, uninterested in reliving the past or granting absolution to someone who'd betrayed basic principles of decency. Some actions didn't deserve forgiveness. They simply deserved to be left behind. Jessica had not reached out at all, and David suspected she never would. But he'd heard through various channels that she was struggling but surviving, working hard to build something legitimate for herself, possibly finally learning the difference between earned success and borrowed status. He wished her well, distantly, the way you might wish well to a stranger whose life once intersected with yours but who now belonged to completely separate narratives. But standing on that roof, with Rachel beside him and a city full of possibilities stretching before him, David realized that his story wasn't about revenge or redemption, but it was about revelation, the slow, painful, ultimately liberating process of discovering who people really were and what actually mattered. He'd been betrayed, but he'd survived. But he'd been lied to, but he'd learned truth. He'd been divorced, but he'd discovered that being alone was better than being with someone who didn't value him properly. And maybe, just maybe, he'd also discovered that the right person had been there all along, disguised as a business opportunity, waiting for him to be ready to see partnership as something other than a test or a trap. "Rachel," David said, surprising himself with his own boldness, "would you like to have dinner sometime? Not a business dinner, just dinner. Two people who respect each other's work, getting to know each other beyond the buildings." Rachel turned to him with a smile that started small but grew to illuminate her entire face. "I thought you'd never ask, but yes, I'd like that very much." "No tests," David promised, and he meant it completely. No secrets or hidden identities, just honesty about who we are and what we want. "That's all I've ever wanted," Rachel said, and David believed her because he'd learned, finally, painfully, to recognize genuine integrity when he saw it. They left the roof together as the stars began to appear above the city. Two people who'd built something meaningful together and were carefully, tentatively, beginning to explore what else they might build. But David's empire remained, vast and profitable and growing. His wealth remained, measured in billions. His privacy remained, carefully guarded by layers of anonymity and protection. But his loneliness was finally, gradually, beginning to ease, not because someone had passed a test or proven themselves worthy, but because he'd stopped testing and started trusting. But not because he'd found someone who loved his money, but because he'd found someone who loved the same things he loved: creation, community, purpose, integrity. And somewhere in Portland, Jessica probably wondered occasionally if she'd made the right choice, if the stable but modest life she'd built was what she really wanted, if the billions she'd walked away from haunted her late at night. But David didn't think about that anymore. He'd spent enough time dwelling on betrayal and regret. Now he thought about blueprints and communities and the woman beside him who saw buildings as homes rather than investments. But he thought about a future built on honesty rather than hidden tests. He thought about second chances and hard-won wisdom, and the possibility that sometimes losing everything meant gaining something more valuable, the clarity to recognize what actually mattered. His birthday came again, 1 year after Jessica had served him divorce papers over breakfast. But this time, David celebrated on a different roof, with Rachel and her team and the families who'd moved into the affordable housing project, with a simple cake and genuine laughter and the satisfaction of work well done. But there were no diamonds or designer clothes or luxury cars to impress anyone. There was just community and connection and the quiet pride of building something meaningful. And when Rachel handed him a birthday card with a hand-drawn sketch of the affordable housing project on the front, David felt something he'd thought he'd lost forever: the simple joy of being valued for who he was rather than what he had. But the card was modest, probably cost less than $3 at the store, but it meant more than any of the expensive gifts Jessica had given him over the years, more than any material possession could ever mean. "Thank you," David said, and he meant it for so much more than just the card. But Rachel seemed to understand, squeezing his hand briefly before turning back to the celebration around them. The city stretched below them, full of buildings David owned and developments he'd funded and communities he'd transformed. But for the first time he understood that he didn't own any of it, not really. But he was just a temporary steward of space and resources, responsible for using them wisely and leaving things better than he found them. The test had never been whether Jessica could love him without money, but the test had been whether David himself could find meaning beyond accumulation, purpose beyond profit, connection beyond the transactions that had defined his professional life. He'd passed finally, though not in the way he'd planned. But Jessica and Richard had given him an unexpected gift through their betrayal: the freedom to stop pretending and start being authentic, the courage to stop testing and start trusting, but the wisdom to recognize that real wealth wasn't measured in billions, but in integrity, community, and the simple satisfaction of work that mattered. And standing on that roof, surrounded by laughter and genuine connection, with a future that finally felt open and hopeful, rather than suspicious and guarded, David Montgomery, secret billionaire, betrayed husband, community developer, and finally just himself, allowed himself to believe that maybe the best chapter of his story was just beginning. But this time, he wouldn't write it alone.